They still had careers advisors when I was at school, but I dare say the only people who wistfully lament their passing are those who never were subject to their ministrations. No, that's unfair. Probably a great many of them gave excellent advice, I just never seemed to hear about any, though I never did find out if the story about the person who said he wanted to work with animals being told he could work in an abattoir was true or not, and it's not very often I don't find something out. Our careers advisor was called Mr. Shannon, and he sported a jacket with leather elbow patches and an air of paternal chumminess. "So, Francesca," he said, "and what career do you have in mind?" I suppose at least he didn't ask what I wanted to do when I grew up. "I want to be a private detective," I said. It wasn't meant to shock. It was just the truth. He didn't exactly look shocked, and I don't think he was that good at hiding his thoughts, but quite used to teenagers with outlandish ambitions. He probably encountered aspiring rock stars and soccer players and the like every day. "That's interesting," he said. "I expect you like reading mystery books." "I most certainly do." I did, but if he thought I only wanted to be a private detective because of my mild addiction to Miss Marple and Lord Peter Wimsey, he was much mistaken. After a pleasant but entirely pointless discussion, he suggested that I might like to be a policewoman. We said policeman and policewoman then, not police officer. I thanked him for the suggestion, which was not entirely unexpected, and didn't tell him that I had more intention of flying to the moon, and he probably had his fair share of potential future astronauts, than being a policewoman. Not that I've anything against the police force. Well, not as a matter of principle. Some of my best friends are in the police, honestly. But I had already decided when I was 8 that after I left school, I was never going to wear a uniform again, nor call any shouty pompous person with a couple of stripes sir. If that was the kind of thing that turned me on, I might as well join the army and at least get a bit of free travel out of it. Mind you, that was in the days when if you leave Northern Ireland out of it, the army hardly ever got involved in any nasty things like wars. I genuinely don't mean to come over all superior and bull-shy about the police. I just knew I had absolutely no wish whatsoever to join their ranks. I saw Mr. Shannon again a couple of years later, and he made out he remembered me. But this time he said that it was always a good idea to get a good degree behind you. I didn't disagree with him, and though I didn't have the impatient fixation on student life some of my classmates did, it was still an experience I quite looked forward to. So I got my degree in politics and history behind me. That surprised a few people who thought I'd be sure to major in English, but I prefer to read books, not analyze them, and resisted the temptation to get a teacher's certificate. Too many people who got a temporary teaching job ended up retiring in their 60s and getting a table lamp and a limp bunch of carnations. Though I was single-minded and even more determined than ever to follow my career choice, I was realistic enough to know that I couldn't just, straight from university, with no experience or references and limited means, put a small ad in the paper and in the phone directory and expect it to happen overnight. Though I had even less intention of being a secretary than I did of being a policewoman or a teacher, I had decided even before leaving school that it was sensible to equip myself with some secretarial skills. I was a quick and accurate typist, and though the demand for this was dying out, it wasn't dead yet and I could see the usefulness of it. Could take things down in shorthand, though it was a strange variant form of Greg's and my own inventions and abbreviations. I had a phone manner that at least didn't irritate folk and could muddle through most filing systems. I dropped on lucky with covering for maternity leave at the local solicitor's office. I've discovered now that Hugh Walpole invented a very fine word for that. Serendipity. Isn't Google a wonderful thing? There was something that suited me fine about covering for maternity leave. It meant that my tenure was likely to be short-term and I wouldn't slip into being part of the furniture in Matthews and Maltby before I knew what had happened. I won't say that I kept my ears open and my mouth shut. My mouth doesn't take altogether kindly to being kept shut for too long, but I prided myself on being what Miss Marple called a noticing sort of person. I noticed it when a client who was otherwise smartly dressed had shoes that were down at heel, and when someone who assured us they had all the time in the world kept furtively glancing at their watch. I was careful not to interfere in any of the cases, but did sometimes, casually, let something drop. Mr. Matthews, there was still a Mr. Matthews, the grandson of the original one, but no more Mr. Maltby, was quite a noticing person himself, and one day he said, "You're a very observant young woman, Francesca. Have you ever thought about doing a law degree?" No, I had not, and no, I was not going to, but I was still quite flattered. "Tell me to mind my own business," he said, a couple of days later. But what are you planning to do? Jessica will be back here soon, and it goes without saying I'll give you a good reference. But you have a very keen brain, and though there's nothing at all wrong with office work, I fancy though you do it well, your heart isn't entirely in it. I want to be a private detective, I said. I didn't exactly blurt it out, but hadn't planned telling him. Rather to my surprise, I'm not infallible after all. He took me seriously. We work with them sometimes, you know? If you're really set on it, I can put in a word. Well, for all I had fine ideas about making my own way and not being beholden to anyone, I was also pragmatic, and by no means against Mr. Matthews putting in a word. So the word was duly put in, and I was introduced to Zacharias Flint. Zacharias Flint was such a perfect name for a private detective that I wondered if he'd had it changed by deed poll, but he assured me it was his given name, and I believed him. But like everyone else, I called him Zach. Despite his glamorous name, he looked just like a solicitor himself, though without the tie. He was a quietly spoken middle-aged man with a liking for model boats and mint humbugs. He was courteous to a fault and didn't fit into the stereotype of tongue-lashing and belittling his apprentice, as I thought of myself, though I don't think Zach ever used the word, but was quite intent on finding out if I were serious. He set me a series of tedious tasks and I passed with flying colors. "You're good, Francesca," he said one day in his simple way, and although he was no mindless spiller of insults, his compliments were still hard to come by. So life got more interesting, and he had already said, "I'll miss you, kid, but it's time you were thinking of being your own boss." Fond as I was of Zach, I very much liked the sound of being my own boss, but he was still my boss when I was assigned to the Morales case. Zach had rarely ailed a day in his life, as he was wont to boast, but rather to his own disgust he had a heart attack. He survived and would be fine, but was on doctors' and wife's orders to rest for a couple of months. "Do you think you can handle the Morales case, Francesca?" he asked when I visited him in hospital. "You bet I can," I assured him. I admit I had neglected to tell him that there was a degree of emotional involvement. Oh, don't get me wrong, I had never met the author Conrad Morales, but he was certainly one of my favorite writers. His wry humor and deep emotional insights even made me overlook some of his plot weaknesses. He was a fascinating character, too. I told myself it didn't matter that he was good-looking though he was, with a smile that could be sardonic and sweet at the same time, and yes, I know it's the oldest cliché in the book, soulful dark eyes. Those eyes had more cause than usual to be soulful at the moment, as his partner, Adam, had been murdered. I know it sounds like protesting too much, but I was glad that he was gay and I was straight. I wanted our relationship to be platonic and to never hope for it to be anything else. I hurriedly reminded myself that our relationship was to be a professional one. But it's only human kindness to be compassionate to someone who's suffered a bereavement, isn't it? He was every bit as charming and fascinating as his serial character Jeremy Cohen, whom he always said wasn't an alter ego, but with a bit of a mischievous glint in his eyes, and as he appeared when he made his not infrequent TV appearances. And you'd have needed a heart of solid granite not to be moved by his bravery and dignity. He wore his grief with grace, but sometimes there was a red rim to those eyes of his. Though he had a reputation for a degree of impatience, he was very patient with me when my investigations seemed to meet dead ends. Officially, of course, it was still in the hands of the police and I was helping out. It didn't suit them, but D.I. Lawrence Burton and I achieved a degree of reluctant mutual respect. I told you I had friends in the police. Okay, friends might be pushing it a bit. We were both equally frustrated. True, Adam had been set upon on the canal towpath, not in the town center of the lake, but it was hardly the Amazon. People walked their dogs along it, or indulged their passion for night fishing, and there was a pub on its banks. His money and his bank card hadn't been taken, but his wedding ring. Technically, he and Conrad had only had a civil partnership ceremony, but I knew they definitely regarded the matching gold bands as wedding rings. How cruel is that? Lawrence had exclaimed, and I warmed to him. Though he wasn't homophobic, he still had some mixed feelings, but it was plain he was sincere. Adam had also been very unlucky. Though the stab wound in his thigh was undeniably nasty, and he had lost a lot of blood, most men who, like him, were fairly young and had kept themselves fit would probably have survived. There was something noble about Conrad. Once he said that the only reason he wanted the perpetrator caught was to protect other people. He wasn't interested in vengeance. And Adam wouldn't have been, he said. Zach was at home now, and for a man who was normally so pleasant and laid back, the crankiest of convalescents. I won't tell you two not to talk shop, his wife Rhoda said wryly. It might help keep him and me sane, but I should have known he wouldn't let me get away with anodyne chit-chat. He had realized now that I, to put it mildly, admired Conrad. Now listen, he said. What I'm not going to do is lecture you about not getting on any further with the case. That happens to all of us, me most certainly included. Anyone who says any case can be solved is lying or delusional. Larry Burton seems to be getting no further, and I've time for him. But you're too fond of Conrad Morales. You don't like him, Zach. You hardly hide the fact. I don't know the man apart from seeing him on TV sometimes. Fair enough, I've not taken to him, but he's one of those Marmite characters. I realize that, and before you say it, Francesca, don't accuse me of being something you know perfectly well I'm not. It had crossed my mind and I was a little ashamed. Unless it came to stupidity, nobody was more generally tolerant and broad-minded than Zach. We parted on good terms, but his words had still irritated me. Well, he hadn't mentioned taking me off the case or anything like that, I thought, to my massive relief. There was also, of course, the anomaly. I wanted Adam's killer to be traced and brought to justice, but also knew that though he had said we must stay in touch, it would probably mean the end of my spending so much time with Conrad. Though it was in circumstances I would never in a million lifetimes have wished for, I had become part of the life of someone whom I admired and found fascinating. That doesn't happen to many of us. And I wasn't disappointed either. He wasn't boring or petty or anything to disillusion me. All the same, we have a sense of duty. Oh, we don't have an equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath or anything like that, but getting to the bottom of things is what we do, just like teachers teach and doctors diagnose and particle physicists send protons round a tunnel. Yes, there's the element of solving a puzzle, and it's no coincidence that most of us are good at crosswords, but it's about knowing what makes people tick. Though Zach and I had parted amiably enough, I still had the sense of things not being quite right between us, and when someone's had a brush with death, that matters. I went round again the next evening. He looked very serious and said, Francesca, even though I know how you admire Conrad Morales' books, this is one of his earlier ones you might not have read. I doubted it, and with Conrad earlier was relative as his rise to fame had been pretty meteoric. But I had to admit he was right. It was called Forgotten Flowers and it looks like a proof copy, I said. It is. Please, will you read it? Well, that's hardly going to be a hardship, I said. Zach's expression unnerved me. There was something sad and troubled about it. But I read the book. The regular characters were already there, Jeremy and his best friend Magda, a no-nonsense mother substitute, though he never actually used that expression, and his partner Tommy. I could see why Conrad had no particular urge to push his back catalog. I don't think he could have written a bad book, but it definitely wasn't one of his better ones. Though he didn't pussyfoot about with twee euphemisms, he went easy on what he wryly termed the bedroom bits. But there were sometimes tender scenes between Jeremy and Tommy, and in one of these, there was a reference, only a brief one, to a car crash Tommy had been involved in when he was a child. His life had never been in danger and he was insistent he was over it, but he still had a scar on his right thigh and admitted, "The skin's still tender. I bleed like a stuck pig if I even get a scratch there." Jeremy was wont to tease Tommy about his inelegant language, just as Tommy ragged him for talking posh. It was a part of their relationship. In an instant I knew, and I felt sick and cold and as if nothing in the world made sense anymore, because I knew that I had got to the bottom of it, or rather Zach had, and that the wry, plucky, quirky man with the wonderful prose and the soulful eyes had betrayed Adam in the most terrible way imaginable. And though it was less terrible, and somehow, bathed in the sudden brutal banality of it all, I supposed there would be a day when I would get over this. He had betrayed me. One more thing. I know this doesn't matter in what Zach calls the grand scheme, but he isn't even really called Conrad Morales. He's called Cedric Mudge. I didn't cry. It wasn't cathartic like that. But the next few days passed in a daze. I knew I should tell Lawrence, but somehow I couldn't quite form the words. Each day I vowed it would be the day, and each day I failed. Then one morning, as I miserably spooned sugar into my tea, I realized Lawrence was knocking on my front door. I opened it with trepidation. "Miss Green," he said, as if it was some kind of title. "Francesca." I looked at him mutely. For once I had no clever words. He sighed. "I'm guessing you know about Conrad. Or Cedric, rather." He looked uncomfortable. I nodded. "It's horrible, Francesca. I know how fond you were of him." "Were?" My voice came out a croak. "He's dead, Francesca. Hanged himself during the night in the cells." I stared numbly at the floor, barely hearing Lawrence's words of consolation before he took his leave. Some part of me wanted to feel it was karma, payback for his terrible betrayal of Adam. But most of all, I felt a sickening, searing agony of loss. In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into work, determined to become the best private detective I could be. To prove myself worthy of Zach's mentorship and Conrad's initial faith in me, even if that faith had been misplaced. But the scar ran deep. Betrayal has a way of worming into your soul, spreading like poison. I found myself distrusting clients, second-guessing motives, seeing ulterior intent behind every smile. The optimistic spark that had drawn me to this profession sputtered. Even as my reputation grew and cases poured in, satisfaction eluded me. Late at night, typing up case notes, my thoughts would drift to soulful dark eyes that hid such malice, to a quicksilver wit now extinguished. What a waste, I'd think bitterly. What a bloody waste. Zach watched my meteoric rise with quiet pride, but I could tell he worried. He invited me round for dinner often, plying me with Rhoda's shepherd's pie and gentle conversation. I think he wanted to coax me back to myself, to the eager young apprentice who saw mysteries as thrilling puzzles rather than a daily wade through human wickedness. "You can't let one bad apple sour you on the whole barrel," he said once, his hangdog face creased with concern. I shrugged, sawed at my pie. "I'm fine, Zach. Just busy. Lots of cases, you know." He sighed. "I know. You're in high demand. But don't lose yourself in the work, Francesca. Don't let it steal your sparkle." Sparkle. The word jabbed like a finger to a bruise. What sparkle? I wanted to snap, but I softened at the care in Zach's eyes. Dear old Zach, quietly looking out for me even with his dodgy ticker. "I'm trying," I said at last. "It's just hard sometimes to trust. After Conrad Cedric, whatever his bloody name was." "I know, kid. Believe me, I know. You think I haven't had cases that gutted me? But you can't let the darkness win. You fight it with compassion, with truth, with refusing to believe the worst of people. It's the only way to stay sane in this job." Tears prickled hot behind my eyes. I blinked them back, took a fortifying gulp of tea. I'll keep that in mind. And I did try to remember the feeling that had filled me when I first told Mr. Shannon I wanted to be a detective. That bright, bubbling certainty, that sense of a path unfurling before me. I tried to summon it when cynicism reared its head, when the temptation to mistrust tugged. Some days I succeeded better than others. Cases came and went. A philandering husband here, a spot of corporate espionage there. I even helped Lawrence on a few more murders, our initial wariness thawing into a prickly sort of camaraderie. He seemed glad to see me crawling back from the crater Conrad had blown in my life. Then the Kelsey case landed in my lap. Janine Kelsey, all of 22, honey blonde and whippet thin, perched in my office and begged me to find her missing sister. "The police say she's just a runaway," she said, shredding a monogrammed handkerchief. "But Tasha wouldn't leave me, I know it. Not by choice. She got mixed up with a bad lot. I'm sure they've done something awful." I looked into her pleading blue eyes and felt the old pull, the heady mix of compassion and cunning that had drawn me to the job. "I'll see what I can find out," I said, jotting down details. Last known location, unsavory associates. The thrill of the case humming in my veins. Over the next week, I retraced the missing girl's steps. The trail led from posh Knightsbridge flats to dingy Whitechapel dens, the putrid cloying stench of the drug underworld. Each unsavory character I talked to hinted at something rotten in Tasha's fate. I hardly ate or slept, so consumed was I with untangling her sordid story. It seemed Janine's instincts were right. Natasha Kelsey had fallen prey to forces far more vicious than her own vices. Every clue uncovered, every lead chased, drew me further into a web of exploitation and evil. But with each dead end and double cross, my initial surge of purpose drained away, replaced by that now familiar bitter taste. The world was full of Conrad Moraleses, smiling devils out to destroy sweetness and light. What a damned bloody waste. On the 8th day, a chance encounter with a twitchy bloke named Dodge finally coughed up the info I needed. A location. An abandoned cannery by the docks. The flophouse where Tasha had last been seen. I knew I should call it in to Lawrence, request backup. But the same reckless itch that had spurred me into this line of work in the first place driven me to that seedy stretch of waterfront alone. Lock picks and Colt revolver tucked in my pockets. The cannery loomed, a rotting hulk against the oil-slick Thames. I slipped inside, footsteps echoing on the scummy concrete. Squalid makeshift bedding and scattered drug detritus spoke to the lost souls that squatted here. But no sign of Tasha. Then a muffled thump from the floor above. A ragged cry quickly stifled. I palmed my gun and crept to the rusting stairs. At the top, a dim hallway stretched, dusty glass panes in the office doors opaque with grime. Another muted thud, and the low growl of angry male voices behind the farthest door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Tasha was here, I could feel it, along with the vicious bastards who'd stolen her away. I inched down the hall on cat feet, listening hard. Behind the door, the voices grew clearer. Stupid slag. I told you not to. It was an accident. She just started shaking and... Shut it. Help me get her in the sack. A cold sweat trickled down my spine. No. I was too late. Despair rose like bile in my throat. Then another voice, reedy with terror. Jeff? Dodge? What's going on? Tasha. She was alive. Injured. By the sounds of it, but still breathing. I had a chance to help her, to salvage something from this cesspit. Zach's words rang in my head. Fight the darkness with compassion. I stepped to the door, steadied my shaking hands, and swung it open. All right, lads. Step away from the girl. 3 pairs of bloodshot eyes darted to me, widening almost comically. 2 tracksuit-clad thugs with close-cropped heads, Jeff and Dodge, I presumed. And there, slumped against the grimy wall, was Tasha Kelsey, wan and bruised but wonderfully alive. Jeff recovered first, face twisting in a sneer. What's this? Bit of posh for this postcode. Ain't you love? I leveled my Colt at his doughy face, gratified by his flinch. I said, step away. Tasha stirred, lolling head lifting. Help me, she croaked. Please. You heard her, boys. Party's over. Dodge looked desperately to Jeff, hands flexing. I could read his urge to rush me. 1 slightly built bird against 2 hard men. He fancied his odds. My finger tightened on the trigger. Don't even think it. On your knees, hands behind your heads. Now. Something in my eyes must have warned him I wasn't bluffing. Slowly, glaring daggers, they complied. I pulled out my mobile and hit Lawrence's number, gun never wavering. Di Barton? It's Francesca. I found Tasha Kelsey. You'd best send a car. And an ambulance. The next hours passed in a blue blur. Uniforms swarmed the cannery, cuffing a still-spitting Jeff and Dodge. The paramedics loaded a tearful Tasha onto a stretcher, her grateful gaze finding mine as they wheeled her out. Thank you, she rasped as she passed. Thank you for not giving up. I squeezed her cold hand, throat suddenly tight. Get well soon, Tasha. Your sister's waiting for you. Lawrence oversaw the chaos, shooting me unreadable looks. When the last car pulled away, he cornered me, bushy brows lowered. Taken up vigilantism, have we? You should have called me sooner. There wasn't time, I said, though we both knew it was only half true. I'd needed to do this myself to prove something. I couldn't let her down, Lawrence. And if they'd been armed? If you'd gotten hurt? I looked away. I didn't. Lawrence blew out a long breath. No. You didn't. Jammy git. He knocked my shoulder gruffly. Suppose I can't slag you off too much. seeing as how you did just save a girl's life and put two nasty pieces of work behind bars. Just doing my job, I said, but a smile tugged at my lips, the first real one in ages. Some job, he grumbled. Then quieter, you did good, Green. Risky and reckless, but bloody good. Pride kindled in my chest. I had done good, faced the darkness and found the light. It was still there if you had eyes to see it. The true satisfaction came later, at the hospital, when Janine flung her arms around me and sobbed her thanks into my shoulder. Her sister, battered but mending, beamed at me from the bed, color already returning to her cheeks. I don't know what magic you worked, but I'll never forget it, Janine said. You've no idea what it means, getting her back, but I rather thought I did a bit. Watching the two girls clasp hands, I felt a piece of myself slot back into place. The piece that believed in fighting the good fight, in making a difference. The piece that once glowed with eager joy at the thought of being a detective. It wasn't a complete restoration. I knew I'd never be quite that innocent again. Conrad's betrayal would always leave its mark. But it was enough. Enough to feel the spark rekindle, to stand a little straighter under the mantle of my chosen profession. That night, I rang Zach. Catching him up on the case, I heard a smile in his gruff voice. "There's my girl," he said warmly. Knew she was still in there. I laughed, and it felt like coming home. She just needed reminding what it was all for. You were right, Zach, about fighting darkness with compassion. Course I was right. Cranky old codgers usually are, he said, a grin in the words. You up for a spot of shepherd's pie tomorrow? Rhoda's dying to hear the whole story from the hero herself. Definitely, I said. Rhoda's the shepherd's pies is the best in the world. Only less of the hero talk, yeah? I'm just happy doing my job. No one's just anything, kid. Especially not you. Zach's voice gentled. You're a damn fine detective. One I'm proud to have taught. Don't you forget it. My eyes misted. I won't. Promise. We rang off with the easy fondness of family. Cradling the phone, I looked around my cozy flat, the bookshelves crammed with old friends like Miss Marple and Lord Peter. It wasn't such a bad life I'd chosen. All those years ago in a school advisor's office. A hard one, sometimes. A lonely one. But one threaded through with purpose, with the chance to stand up to the cruelties and injustices of this world. Rising, I fixed myself a cup of tea and flicked on my laptop, opening up a new case file. There was still work to do. As a wise man once told me, it was the only way to keep the sparkle, and I intended to shine on.